The Gormenghast Trilogy by Melvyn Peake. Book 1. Titus Groan. At the Prunsquallors. Mrs. Slagg was so agitated at the sight of an outlandish youth in the company of her Fuchsia that it was several minutes before she had recovered sufficiently to listen to anything in the way of an explanation. Her eyes would dart to and fro from Fuchsia to the features of the intruder. She stood for so long a time, plucking nervously at her lower lip, that Fuchsia realized it was useless to continue with her explanation and was wondering what to do next, when Steerpike's voice broke in. "Madam," he said, addressing Mrs. Slagg, "my name is Steerpike, and I ask you to forgive my sudden appearance at the door of your room." And he bowed very low indeed, his eyes squinting up through his eyebrows as he did so. Mrs. Slagg took 3 uncertain steps towards Fuchsia and clutched her arm. "What is he saying? What is he saying? Oh, my poor heart! Who is he, then? What has he done to you, my only?" "He's coming too," said Fuchsia, by way of an answer. "Wants to see Dr. Prune as well. What's his present? What's he giving me a present for? Come on! Let's go to his house. I'm tired. Be quick. I want to go to bed." Mrs. Slagg suddenly became very active when Fuchsia mentioned her tiredness, and started for the door, holding the girl by her forearm. "You'll be into your bed in no time. I'll put you there myself, and tuck you in, and turn your lamp out for you as I always did, my wickedness, and you can go to sleep until I wake you, my only, and give you your breakfast by the fire. So don't you mind, my tired thing. Only a few minutes with the doctor, only a few minutes." They passed through the door, Mrs. Slagg peering suspiciously around Fuchsia's arm at the quick movements of the high-shouldered boy. Without another word between them, they began to descend several flights of stairs until they reached a hall where armour hung coldly upon the walls, and the corners were stacked with old weapons that were as rich with rust as a hedge of winter beech. It was no place to linger in, for a chill cut upwards from the stone floor, and cold beads of moisture stood like sweat upon the tarnished surface of iron and steel. Steerpike arched his nostrils at the dank air, and his eyes travelled swiftly over the medley of corroding trophies, of hanging panoplies, smouldering with rust, and the stack of small arms, and noted a slim length of steel, whose far end seemed to be embedded in some sort of tube, but it was impossible to make out clearly in the dim light. A sword-stick leapt to his mind, and his acquisitive instincts were sharpened at the thought. There was no time, however, for him to rummage among the heaps of metal at the moment, for he was conscious of the old woman's eyes upon him, and he followed her and Fuchsia out of the hall, vowing to himself that at the first opportunity he would visit the chill place again. The door by which they made their exit lay opposite the flight that led down to the centre of the unhealthy hall. On passing through it, they found themselves at the beginning of an ill-lit corridor, the walls of which were covered with small prints in faded colours. A few of them were in frames, but of these only a small proportion had their glass unbroken. Nanny and Fuchsia, being familiar with the corridor, had no thought for its desolate condition, nor for the mellowed prints that depicted in elaborate but unimaginative detail the more obviously pictorial aspects of Gormenghast. Steerpike rubbed his sleeve across one or two as he followed, removing a quantity of dust, and glanced at them critically, for it was unlike him to let any kind of information slip from him unawares. This corridor ended abruptly at a heavy doorway, which Fuchsia opened with an effort, letting in upon the passage a less oppressive darkness, for it was late evening, and beyond the door a flock of clouds were moving swiftly across a slate-coloured sky in which one star rode alone. "Oh, my poor heart, how late it's getting," said Nanny, peering anxiously at the sky, and confiding her thoughts to Fuchsia in such a surreptitious way that it might be supposed she was anxious that the firmament should not overhear her. "How late it is getting, my only, and I must be back with your mother very soon. I must take her something to drink, the poor huge thing. Oh, no, we mustn't be long." Before them was a large courtyard, and at the opposite corner was a 3-storied building attached to the main bulk of the castle by a flying buttress. By day it stood out strangely from the ubiquitous grey stone of Gormenghast, for it was built with a hard red sandstone from a quarry that had never since been located. Fuchsia was very tired. The day had been overcharged with happenings. Now, as the last of the daylight surrendered in the west, she was still awake and beginning, not ending, another experience. Mrs. Slagg was clasping her arm, and as they approached the main doorway she stopped suddenly, and, as was her usual habit when flustered, brought her hand up to her mouth and pulled at her little lower lip, her old, watery eyes peering weakly at Fuchsia. She was about to say something when the sound of footsteps caused her and her 2 companions to turn and to stare at a figure approaching in the darkness. A faint sound, as of something brittle being broken over and over again, accompanied his progress towards them. "Who is it, my only? Oh, how dark it is!" "It's only Flay," said Fuchsia. "Come on, I'm tired." But they were hailed from the gloom. "Who?" cried the hard, awkward voice. Mr. Flay's idiom, if at times unintelligible, was anything but prolix. "What do you want, Mr. Flay?" shouted Nanny, much to her own and to Fuchsia's surprise. "Slag?" queried the hard voice again. "Wanted," it added. "Who's wanted?" Nanny shrilled back, for she felt that Mr. Flay was always too brusque with her. "Who's with you?" barked Flay, who was now within a few yards. "Free just now." Fuchsia, who had long ago acquired the knack of interpreting the ejaculations of her father's servant, turned her head around at once and was both surprised and relieved to find that Steerpike had disappeared. And yet, was there a tinge of disappointment as well? She put out her arm and pressed the old nurse against her side. "3 just now," repeated Flay, who had come up. Mrs. Slagg had also noticed that the boy was missing. "Where is he?" she queried. "Where's the ugly youth?" Fuchsia shook her head glumly and then turned suddenly on Flay, whose limbs seemed to straggle away into the night. Her weariness made her irritable, and now she vented her pent-up emotion upon the dour servant. "Go away! Go away!" she sobbed. "Who wants you here, you stupid spiky thing? Who wants you? Who wants you? Shouting out who's there, and thinking yourself so important when you're only an old, thin thing. Go away to my father where you belong, but leave us alone." And Fuchsia, bursting into a great exhausted cry, ran up to the emaciated Flay, and throwing her arms about his waist, drenched his waistcoat in her tears. His hands hung at his sides, for it would not have been right for him to touch the Lady Fuchsia, however benevolent his motive, for he was, after all, only a servant, although a most important one. "Please go now," said Fuchsia at last, backing away from him. "Ladyship," said the servant, after scratching the back of his head. "Lordship wants her." He jerked his head at the old nurse. "Me?" cried Nanny Slagg, who had been sucking her teeth. "You," said Flay. "Oh, my poor heart! When does he want me?" "Oh, my dear body, what can he want?" "Wants you tomorrow," replied Flay, and turning about, began to walk away, and was soon lost to sight, and a short time afterwards even the sound of his knee-joints were out of hearing. They did not wait any longer, but walked as swiftly as they could to the main door of the house of sandstone, and Fuchsia gave a heavy rap with the door-knocker, rubbing with her sleeve at the moisture in her eyes. As they waited, they could hear the sound of a violin. Fuchsia knocked at the door again, and a few seconds later the music ceased, and footsteps approached and stopped. A bolt was drawn back, the door opened upon a strong light, and the doctor waved them in. Then he closed the door behind them, but not before a thin youth had squeezed himself past the doorpost and into the hall, where he stood between Fuchsia and Mrs. Slagg. "Well, said the doctor, flicking a hair from the sleeve of his coat and flashing his teeth. "So you have brought a friend with you, my dear little ladyship. So you have brought a friend with you, or," and he raised his eyebrows, "haven't you?" For the second time, Mrs. Slagg and Fuchsia turned about to discover the object of the doctor's inquiry, and found that Steerpike was immediately behind them. He bowed, and with his eye on the doctor, "At your service," he said.
"But I don't want anyone at my service,"
said Dr. Prunsquallor, folding his long white hands around each other as though they were silk scarves.
"I'd rather have somebody in my service, perhaps, but not at it. Oh, no, I wouldn't have any service left if every young gentleman who arrived through my door was suddenly at it. It would soon be in shreds, absolutely in shreds."
"He's come," said Fuchsia in her slow voice, "because he wants to work, because he's clever, so I brought him."
"Indeed," said Prunsquallor. "I have always been fascinated by those who want to work. Most absorbing to observe them. Most absorbing and uncanny. Walk along, dear ladies, walk along. My very dear Mrs. Slagg, you look 100 years younger every day. This way, this way. Mind the corner of that chair, my very dear Mrs. Slagg, and oh, my dear woman, you must look where you're going. By all that's circumspect, you really must. Now, just allow me to open this door, and then we shall make ourselves comfortable. That's right, Fuchsia, my dear, proper up, proper up."
So saying, and shepherding them in front of him, and at the same time rolling his magnified eyes all over Steerpike's extraordinary costume, the doctor at last arrived within his own room, and closed the door behind himself sharply with a click. Mrs. Slagg was ushered into a chair with soft wine-coloured upholstery, where she looked particularly minute, and Fuchsia into another of the same pattern. Steerpike was waved to a high-backed piece of oak, and the doctor himself set about bringing bottles and glasses from a cupboard let into the wall.
"What is it to be? What is it to be? Fuchsia, my dear child, what do you fancy?"
"I don't want anything, thank you," said Fuchsia. "I feel like going to sleep, Dr. Prune."
"A little stimulant, perhaps. Something to sharpen your faculties, my dear. Something to tide you over until you are snug within your little bed. What do you think? What do you think?"
"I don't know," said Fuchsia.
"Ha! But I do,
said the doctor, and whinnied like a horse. Then, pulling back his sleeves so that his wrists were bare, he advanced like some sort of fastidious bird towards the door, where he pulled a cord in the wall. Lowering his sleeves again neatly over his cuffs, he waited on tiptoe until he heard a sound without, at which he flung open the door, uncovering, as it were, a swarthy skinned creature in white livery whose hand was raised as though to knock upon the panels. Before the doctor had said a word, Nanny leaned forward in her chair. Her legs, unable to reach the floor, were dangling helplessly.
"It's elderberry wine that you love best, isn't it?"
she queried in a nervous, penetrating whisper to Fuchsia.
"Tell the doctor that. Tell him that at once. You don't want any stimulant, do you?"
The doctor tilted his head slightly at the sound, but did not turn, merely raising his forefinger in front of the servant's eyes and wagging it, and his thin, rasping voice gave an order for a powder to be mixed and for a bottle of elderberry wine to be procured. He closed the door, and, dancing up to Fuchsia, "Relax, my dear, relax," he said. "Let your limbs wander wherever they like, as long as they do not stray too far. As long as they don't stray too far. Think of each of them in turn until they're all as limp as jellyfish, and you'll be ready to run to the twisted woods and back before you know where you are." He smiled, and his teeth flashed. His mop of grey hair glistened like twine in the strong lamplight. "And what for you, Mrs. Slagg? What for Fuchsia's Nanny? A little port?" Mrs. Slagg ran her tongue between her wrinkled lips and nodded as her fingers went to her mouth, on which a silly little smile hovered. She watched the doctor's every movement as he filled up the wine-glass and brought it over to her. She bowed in an old-fashioned way from her hips as she took the glass, her legs pointing out stiffly in front of her, for she had edged herself further back in the chair, and might as well have been sitting on a bed. Then all at once the doctor was back at Fuchsia's chair and bending over her. His hands, wrapped about each other in a characteristic manner, were knotted beneath his chin.
I've got something for you, my dear. Did your nurse tell you?
His eyes rolled to the side of his glasses, giving him an expression of fantastic roguery, which on his face would have been, for one who had never met him, to say the least, unsettling. Fuchsia bent forward, her hands on the red bolster-like arms of the chair. "Yes, Dr. Prune. What is it? Thank you, what is it?"
Ha ha! Aha! It is something for you to wear, if you like it, and if it's not too heavy. I don't want to fracture your cervical vertebrae, my little lady, oh no. By all that's most healthy, I wouldn't care to do that, but I'll trust you to be careful. You will, won't you?
Yes, I will, said Fuchsia. He bent even closer to Fuchsia.
Your baby brother has hurt you. I know, I know,
the doctor whispered, and the sound edged between his rows of big teeth, very faintly, but not so faintly as to escape Steerpike's hearing.
I have a stone for your bosom, my dear child, for I saw the diamonds within your tear ducts when you ran from your mother's door. These, if they come again, must be balanced by a heavier, if less brilliant stone lying upon your bosom.
Prunsquallor's eyes remained quite still for a moment. His hands were still clasped at his chin. Fuchsia stared. "Thank you, Dr. Prune," she said at last. The physician relaxed and straightened himself. He trilled, and then bent forward to whisper again.
So I have decided to give you a stone from another land.
He put his hand into his pocket, but kept it there as he glanced over his shoulder.
Who is your friend of the fiery eyes, my Fuchsia? Do you know him well?
Fuchsia shook her head and stuck her lower lip out as though with instinctive distaste. The doctor winked at her, his magnified right eye closing enormously.
A little later, perhaps,
said Prunsquallor, opening his eyelid again like some sort of sea creature.
When the night is a little further advanced, a little longer in the molar.
He straightened himself.
When the world hath swung through space a further 100 miles or so, then, yes, then.
And for the second time he looked, knowing, and winked. Then he swung around upon his heel.
And now, he said, what will you have? And what in the name of hosiery are you wearing?
Steerpike got to his feet. I am wearing what I am forced to wear until clothes can be found which are more appropriate, he said. These rags, although an official uniform, are as absurd upon me as they are insulting. Sir, he continued, you asked me what I would take. Brandy, I thank you, sir. Brandy. Mrs. Slag, staring her poor old eyes practically out of their hot sockets, peered at the doctor as the speech ended, to hear what he could possibly say after so many words. Fuchsia had not been listening. Something to wear, he had said. Something to lie heavily on her bosom. A stone. Tired as she was all excitement to know what it could be. Dr. Prunsquallor had always been kind to her, if rather above her, but he had never given her a present before. What colour would the heavy stone be? What would it be? What would it be? The doctor was for a moment nonplussed at the youth's self-assurance, but he did not show it. He simply smiled like a crocodile.
Am I mistaken, dear boy, or is that a kitchen jacket you're wearing?
Not only is this a kitchen jacket, but these are kitchen trousers and kitchen socks and kitchen shoes, and everything is kitchen about me, sir, except myself, if you don't mind me saying so, Doctor.
And what,
said Prunsquallor, placing the tips of his fingers together,
are you beneath your fetid jacket, which I must say looks amazingly unhygienic even for Swelter's kitchen? What are you? Are you a problem case, my dear boy, or are you a clear-cut young gentleman with no ideas at all?
With your permission, Doctor, I am neither. I have plenty of ideas, though at the moment plenty of problems too.
Is that so?
Said the doctor.
Is that so? How very unique. Have your brandy first, and perhaps some of them will fade gently away upon the fumes of that very excellent narcotic. Yes, fade gently and imperceptibly away." And he fluttered his long fingers in the air.
At this moment, a knock upon the door panels caused the doctor to cry out in his extraordinary falsetto,
"Make entry! Come along, my dear fellow! Make entry! What in the name of all that's rapid are you waiting for?"
The door opened, and the servant entered, balancing a tray upon which stood a bottle of elderberry wine and a small white cardboard box. He deposited the bottle and the box upon the table and retired. There was something sullen about his manner. The bottle had been placed upon the table with perhaps too casual a movement. The door had clicked behind him with rather too sharp a report. Steerpike noticed this, and when he saw the doctor's gaze return to his face, he raised his eyebrows quizzically, and shrugged his shoulders the merest fraction. Prunsquallor brought a brandy bottle to the table in the centre of the room, but first poured out a glass of elderberry wine which he gave to Fuchsia with a bow.
"Drink, my Fuchsia dear," he said. "Drink to all those things that you love best. I know," he added, with his hands folded at his chin again. "Drink to everything that's bright and glossy. Drink to the coloured things."
Fuchsia nodded her head unsmilingly at the toast and took a gulp. She looked up at the doctor very seriously. "It's nice," she said. "I like elderberry wine. Do you like your drink, Nanny?" Mrs. Slagg very nearly spilt her port over the arm of the chair when she heard herself addressed. She nodded her head violently.
"And now for the brandy," said the doctor. "The brandy for Master...
Steerpike," said the youth. "My name is Steerpike, sir."
"Steerpike of the many problems," said the doctor. "What did you say they were? My memory is so very untrustworthy. It's as fickle as a fox. Ask me to name the third lateral blood vessel from the extremity of my index finger that runs east to west when I lie on my face at sundown, or the percentage of chalk to be found in the knuckles of an average spinster in her 57th year. or even ask me, dear boy, of the details of the pulse rate of frogs 2 minutes before they die of scabies. These things are no tax upon my memory. But ask me to remember exactly what you said your problems were a minute ago, and you will find that my memory has forsaken me utterly. Now, why is that, my dear Master Steerpike? Why is that?"
"Because I never mentioned them," said Steerpike.
"That accounts for it," said Prunsquallor. "That no doubt accounts for it."
"I think so, sir," said Steerpike.
"But you have problems,"
said the doctor. Steerpike took the glass of brandy which the doctor had poured out. "My problems are varied," he said. "The most immediate is to impress you with my potentialities. To be able to make such an unorthodox remark is in itself a sign of some originality. I am not indispensable to you at the moment, sir, because you have never made use of my services. But after a week's employment under your roof, sir, I could become so. I would be invaluable. I am purposely precipitous in my remarks. Either you reject me here and now, or you have already at the back of your mind a desire to know me further. I am 17, sir. Do I sound like 17? Do I act like 17? I am clever enough to know I am clever. You will forgive my undiplomatic approach, sir, because you are a gentleman of imagination. That, then, sir, is my immediate problem. To impress you with my talent, which would be put to your service in any and every form." Steerpike raised his glass. "To you, sir, if you will allow my presumption." The doctor, all this while, had had his glass of cognac raised, but it had remained motionless an inch from his lips, until now, as Steerpike ended and took a sip at his brandy, he sat down suddenly in a chair beside the table and set down his own glass, untasted.
Well, he said at last. Well. By all that's intriguing, this is really the quintessential. What maladdress, by all that's impudent. What an enormity of surface. What a very rare frenzy indeed.
And he began to whinny, gently at first, but after a little while his high-pitched laughter increased in volume and in tempo, and within a few minutes he was helpless with the shrill gale of his own merriment. How so great a quantity of breath and noise managed to come from lungs that must have been in the tube of a chest, wedged uncomfortably close together, it is difficult to imagine. Keeping, even at the height of his paroxysms, an extraordinary theatrical elegance, he rocked to and fro in his chair, helpless for the best part of 9 minutes, after which, with difficulty, he drew breath thinly through his teeth with a noise like the whistling of steam, and eventually, still shaking a little, he was able to focus his eyes upon the source of his enjoyment.
"Well, Prodigy, my dear boy, you have done me a lot of good. My lungs have needed something like that for a long time."
"I have done something for you already, then," said Steerpike, with the clever imitation of a smile on his face. During the major part of the doctor's helplessness he had been taking stock of the room, and had poured himself out another glass of brandy. He had noted the objets d'art, the expensive carpets and mirrors, and the bookcase of calf-bound volumes. He had poured out some more port for Mrs. Slagg, and had ventured to wink at Fuchsia, who had stared emptily back, and he had turned the wink into an affection of his eye. He had examined the labels on the bottles and their year of vintage. He had noticed that the table was of walnut, and that the ring upon the doctor's right hand was in the form of a silver serpent holding between its gaping jaw a nugget of red gold. At first the doctor's laughter had caused him a shock, and a certain mortification, but he was soon his cold, calculating self, with his ordered mind like a bureau with tabulated shelves and pigeonholes of reference, and he knew that at all costs he must be pleasant. He had taken a risky turning in playing such a boastful card, and at the moment it could not be proved either a failure or a success, but he did know that to be able to take risks was the keynote of the successful man. Prunsquallor, when his strength and muscular control were restored sufficiently, sipped at his cognac in what seemed a delicate manner, but Steerpike was surprised to see that he had soon emptied the glass. This seemed to do the doctor a lot of good. He stared at the youth.
"You do interest me, I must admit that much, Master Steerpike," he said. "Oh, yes, I'll go that far. Yes, you interest me, or rather you tantalize me in a pleasant sort of way. But whether I want to have you hanging around my house is, as you with your enormous brain will readily admit, quite a different kettle of fish."
"I don't hang about, sir. It is one of those things I never do." Fuchsia's voice came slowly across the room. "You hung about in my room," she said, and then, bending forward, she looked up at the doctor with an almost imploring expression.
"He climbed there," she said. "He's clever."
Then she leaned back in her chair.
"I am tired. And he saw my own room that nobody ever saw before he saw it, and it is worrying me. Oh, Dr. Prune."
There was a pause.
"He climbed there," she said again.
"I had to go somewhere," said Steerpike. "I didn't know it was your room. How could I have known? I am sorry, your ladyship." She did not answer. Prunsquallor had looked from one to the other.
"Ha ha! Ha ha! Take a little of this powder, Fuchsia dear," he said,
bringing across to her the white cardboard box. He removed the lid and tilted a little into her glass, which he filled again with elderberry wine.
"You won't taste anything at all, my dear girl. Just sip it up, and you will feel as strong as a mountain tiger. Mrs. Slagg, you will take this box away with you 4 times a day, with whatever the dear child happens to be drinking. It is tasteless, it is harmless, and it is extremely efficacious, Do not forget my good woman, will you? She needs something, and this is the very something she needs. This is the very something."
Nanny received the box on which was written, "Fuchsia, 1 teaspoonful to be taken 4 times a day."
"Master Steerpike," said the doctor, "is that the reason you wanted to see me? To beard me in my den, and to melt my heart like tallow upon my own hearthrug?"
He tilted his head at the youth. "That is so, sir," said Steerpike. "With Lady Fuchsia's permission, I accompanied her. I said to her, 'Just let me see the doctor and put my case to him, and I am confident he will be impressed.'" There was a pause. Then, in a confidential voice, Steerpike added, "In my less ambitious moments, it is as a research scientist that I see myself, sir, and in my still less ambitious, as a dispenser."
"What knowledge of chemicals have you, if I may venture to remark?" said the doctor.
"Under your initial guidance, my powers would develop as rapidly as you could wish," said Steerpike.
"You are a clever little monster," said the doctor,
tossing off another cognac and placing the glass upon the table with a click.
"A diabolically clever little monster."
"That is what I hoped you would realise, Doctor," said Steerpike. "But haven't all ambitious people something of the monstrous about them? You, sir, for instance, if you will forgive me, are a little bit monstrous."
"But, my poor youth,"
said Prunsquallor, beginning to pace the room,
"there is not the minutest molecule of ambition in my anatomy, monstrous though it may appear to you."
His laughter had not the spontaneous, uncontrollable quality that it usually possessed. "But, sir," said Steerpike, "there has been."
"And why do you think so?"
"Because of this room. Because of the exquisite furnishings you possess. Because of your calf-bound books, your glassware, your violin. You could not have collected together such things without ambition."
"That is not ambition, my poor confused boy," said the doctor. "It is a union between those erstwhile incompatibles. Taste and a hereditary income."
"Is not taste a cultivated luxury?" said Steerpike.
"But yes," said the doctor, "but yes. One has the potentialities for taste. On finding this out about oneself, after a little self-probing, it is a cultivated thing, as you remark."
"Which needs assiduous concentration and diligence, no doubt," said the youth.
But yes,"
answered the doctor, smiling, with a note in his voice that suggested it was only common politeness in him to keep amused. "Surely such diligence is the same thing as ambitiousness. Ambitiousness to perfect your taste. This is what I mean by ambition, Doctor. I believe you have it. I do not mean ambition for success is a meaningless word. The successful, so I hear, being very often to themselves failures of the first water."
"You interest me," said Prunsquallor. "I would like to speak to Lady Fuchsia alone. We haven't been paying very much attention to her, I am afraid. We have deserted her. She is alone in a desert of her own.
Only watch her." Fuchsia's eyes were shut as she leaned back in the chair, her knees curled up under her.
"While I speak with her, you will be so very, very good as to leave the room. There's a chair in the hall, Master Steerpike. Thank you, dear youth. It would be a handsome gesture."
Steerpike disappeared at once, taking his brandy with him. Prunsquallor looked at the old woman and the girl. Mrs. Slag, with her little mouth wide open, was fast asleep. Fuchsia had opened her eyes at the sound of the door shutting behind Steerpike. The doctor immediately beckoned her to approach. She came to him at once, her eyes wide. "I've waited so long, Dr. Prune," she said. "Can I have my stone now?"
"This very moment," said the doctor. "This very second. You will not know very much about the nature of this stone, but you will treasure it more than anyone I could possibly think of. Fuchsia, dear, you were so distraught as you ran like a wild pony away from your father and me, so distraught with your black mane and your big hungry eyes, that I said to myself, 'It's for Fuchsia,' although ponies don't usually care much about such things. But you will, won't you?"
The doctor took from his pocket a small pouch of softest leather.
"Take it out yourself," he said. "Draw it out with this slender chain."
Fuchsia took the pouch from the doctor's hand, and from it drew forth into the lamplight a ruby like a lump of anger. It burned in her palm. She did not wonder what she ought to say. There was nothing at all to say. Dr. Prunsquallor knew something of what she felt. At last, clutching the solid fire between her fingers, she shook Nanny Slag, who screamed a little as she awoke. Fuchsia got to her feet and dragged her to the door. A moment before the doctor opened it for them, Fuchsia turned her face up to his and parted her lips in a smile of such dark, sweet loveliness, so subtly blended with her brooding strangeness, that the doctor's hand clenched the handle of the door. He had never seen her look like this before. He had always thought of her as an ugly girl of whom he was strangely fond. But now, what was it he had seen? She was no longer a small girl for all her slowness of speech and almost irritating simplicity. In the hall they passed the figure of Steerpike, sitting comfortably on the floor beneath a large carved clock. They did not speak, and when they parted with the doctor, Nanny said, "Thank you," in a sleepy voice, and bowed slightly, one of her hands in Fuchsia's. Fuchsia's fingers clenched the blood-red stone, and the doctor only said,
"Goodbye, and take care, my dears, take care. Happy dreams, happy dreams,"
before he closed the door.